down under. What was that? The same thought ran through his mind as Daniel ran from Ian. Looking back, he recalled what caused him to run in the first place. At first, it was the group Ian traveled with. They had disappeared without explanation, and then there were the dreams about the woman, which Ian somehow knew about. It was all of this, but the most important was just the look in Ian's eyes. Something was just not right. It was as if the version he'd been interacting with was a fake, and that the glimpse of what he just saw was the real Ian. He had only gotten away because he had never considered where he was going. The caves twisted and turned, and he took any random direction he could find. Several tunnels were spread throughout, and while he initially considered it one big cave, different tunnels led to various things. While trying to escape Ian, he took a tunnel that glowed emerald green. When running into it, he could see that there was much more plant life in that area. The walls were covered in vines, and the illuminance flowers from before were also present. The further he traveled, the less it felt like a cave and more like a forest. Rounding a corner, he tripped and fell into a pool of water. Pulling himself upright, he gasped for air. When he sat up, he saw that the water came up around his knees, or they would have had he been standing. The area also housed several trees. A wetland in the middle of all of this couldn't rank as the strangest thing around, because he knew there must be more to come. But when he looked closely, he could see one odd detail he had missed when he arrived. The trees were a dark blue, which seemed to complement the surroundings. He braced himself against the nearest one to lift himself up onto his feet. That's when he could feel the tree shift under the pressure of his hand. Despite its look, it reminded Daniel of a foam mattress. His hand made a mark even after Daniel pulled it away. He stayed there mesmerized by the imprint he made on the tree. He was so engrossed that he hardly noticed that he found that if he wanted to keep it in view, he would have to look up because, apparently, the forest was rising. Or more accurately, was that Daniel was sinking. Shaking off the trance, Daniel realized that the knee-high water was now closer to waist height. A cold shiver ran through his spine as Daniel grasped what was happening to him. He threw his legs up and down to escape the strange swamp. But it was no use. His giant steps splashed the water only for him to have gained a few feet. Panic began to set in until he found a small ray of hope not too far from where he was. He spotted a small island nearby and directed all his efforts to reach it. He hadn't seen it before because a small level of mist had set in and blocked his view of the tiny island until Daniel got closer. However, every step seemed to work against him. He would get closer to land in one sense, only to lose it while sinking to the bottom. He thought perhaps he could swim his way there, although when he used his arms to paddle through the water, he felt even though they made no contact with the ground underneath, he still felt his arms sinking or just being pulled to the bottom by some unseen force. The water now rose to his neck, and it took everything he had to keep his head above it. This only lasted for a few seconds as water made its way into his mouth. He hadn't prepared for it and choked the water back up. His heart pounded in his chest as he accepted the very real possibility that he would die soon. Drowning, was that how he would escape this place? Something in him didn't want this to be the end, so with everything, he crouched under the water, taking a giant inhale of breath as he did. His legs exploded with power as he made a large leap through the water, performing his best breaststroke. He had no idea if he was any good of a swimmer in the life he had before, but right now, he hoped so. Within seconds, his hand reached the edge of the island. At first, he couldn't get a hold of it because everything crumbled into the water as quickly as Daniel grabbed it. After the third attempt, he felt something under the water that he could grab hold of. It felt like a vine. Honestly, Daniel couldn't care less what it was. All he knew was that it didn't break. He gripped tight of it and pulled. Something sharp pierced his skin and Daniel wheezed in pain, but Daniel refused to let go. His hands followed the vine until it reached the top of the landmass and Daniel started to pull his way upward. He managed to pull his body halfway out of the water and decided he could breathe just a little easier. He had just started to pull himself out of the swamp when something caught his eye, causing him to freeze. Someone stood just a few yards away. The fog still covered the area, so Daniel couldn't get a clear view, but he could tell she was a woman with dark hair. The only other detail that stood out was that she wasn't dressed in the same white jumpsuit that he and everyone else he met wore. She didn't seem to notice him because her back was turned. Daniel thought it was strange that she hadn't seen him yet, as he was sure he had made enough noise earlier to keep from drowning. Even stranger was the feeling of déjà vu, as if he had seen this sight before something had caught his attention from the corner of his eye. It was flowers, but not the ones that glowed earlier. No, these were from his dream, which meant the woman. Something in him urged him to shout so she would turn around, but stronger than that urge was another feeling: fear. As she turned to walk away, Daniel felt helpless. The moment she was out of view, he felt something grab hold of his legs. It wrapped around tightly and began pulling him down into the swamp. Daniel couldn't see what it was, but it felt like the vines he had clung to stay above water had just started to pull himself out of the swamp when something caught his eye, causing him to freeze. Someone stood just a few yards away from him. Fog still covered the area, so Daniel couldn't get a clear view, but he could tell that whoever it was, she was a woman with dark hair. The only other detail that stood out was that she wasn't dressed in the same white jumpsuit that he and everyone else he met wore. She didn't seem to notice him because her back was turned. Daniel thought it was strange that she hadn't seen him yet, as he was sure he had made enough noise earlier to keep from drowning. What was even stranger was the feeling of déjà vu, as if he had seen this sight before something had caught his attention from the corner of his eye. It was flowers, but not the ones that glowed earlier. No, these were from his dream, which meant the woman. Something in him urged him to shout so she would turn around, but stronger than that urge was another feeling: fear. As she started to walk away, Daniel felt helpless. The moment she was out of view, he felt something grab hold of his legs. It wrapped around tightly and began to pull him down into the swamp. Daniel couldn't see what it was, but it felt like the vines he had clung to stay above water. He was in no mood to appreciate the irony of the situation. Whatever force was tugging at him was strong, yet before he could get halfway out of the swamp, he had already exhausted a considerable amount of strength. The vines had pulled him back in so far that the water filled his mouth again, causing him to choke on the eerie liquid. His energy began to wane, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he would be taken. Realizing this, he decided not to delay the inevitable and let go of the vine. His descent was quick. One moment, Daniel had a lung full of air, and the next, he was several feet underwater. Looking down, he could see that the strange vines still held him and pulled him downward. The light of the surface grew dimmer, and Daniel wondered just how long he had before his breath of air finally gave out, which, perhaps by chance or unconsciously, will happen in the next moment. He lost concentration and let out his last bit of air. For what seemed like an eternity, there were no thoughts. He expected to die soon, so when that wasn't the case, he opened his eyes to find that he was perfectly fine. He was still being dragged underwater, but he wasn't suffering or in any amount of pain. He found that he could breathe just fine. Why was he not dead, he thought. But what was even more strange was his almost lack of fear. He was more fearful of getting the mysterious woman to notice him than whatever this was. At first, the water was dark, and if the vines weren't still dragging him down, Daniel wouldn't know up from down right now. But soon, something caught his eye, a small light coming toward him. The radiant green held both an allure and fear. As it reached him, Daniel saw that it looked like a sort of jellyfish. Not long after, several others appeared and surrounded Daniel. The one in front started to shift, and soon its shape began to change. It also seemed to grow as it was now twice Daniel's size. When it completed its changes, Daniel saw that it was now the shape of a human head, That alone would have been enough to cause Daniel to be anxious. But what made him even more so was who the head was. It was Ian's. Ian's glowing green head hovered over him. At first, it looked more like a still image. Then the eyes started to move and look down at Daniel. Its mouth then curled into a smile. It sent shivers down Daniel's spine, and he desperately wanted to escape. Just then, the rest of the green entities also started to change their shape. Instead of giant floating heads, they became large spheres. They were still green in color, but also glass-like, and they began to produce images inside them. All of them were different. As Daniel floated down, he tried to take a glance to see what they were. Inside one was the woman he saw earlier, still with her back toward him. Another showed Ian in a similar jumpsuit instead. This one was orange, and between his hands Daniel could see a pair of handcuffs. More images filled the spheres, and Daniel almost found them familiar. But when he did, a feeling of dread took over. "No!" Daniel screamed, and the spheres floated away. After their disappearance, light illuminated from underneath as the ground opened up, bringing a vortex under the swamp waters. Viciously spinning him around as the vines pulled him into the void, Daniel found himself spewing out of the water. His body was flung over onto dry land. The impact wasn't too bad, but still, it took a while for Daniel to recover. Once he did, he once again found himself within cavern walls. He spotted some flowers ahead and decided that it was just what he needed to dry off.